Well, here I am with my friend Vanessa Spina from KetogenicGirl.com. Great podcast, Optimal Protein Podcast. If you're looking for phenomenal podcast on functional nutrition, high protein, low carb, metabolic health based nutrition, check it out. She's great on there. And today we're going to go in detail on a study she actually pointed out to me when I was a guest on her podcast. I hadn't actually reviewed it at that time, but I had a chance to review it, and we're going to talk about it in more detail. It is out of the University of Nottingham in the UK, published in Clinical Nutrition, August 2025. And the title of it is Effects of Fasting Mimicking Diets with Low and High Protein Content on Cardiometabolic Health and Autophagy. And it was a randomized parallel group study for 7 days. This is a really, really great study. I'm really glad that you pointed this out, and I'm excited to have this discussion with you, Vanessa.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I love talking to you and so excited to break down and unpack this study because every year there's sort of one study that really stands out for me. You know, last year it was the Tremelin et al. Paper that came out, no upper limit on muscle protein synthesis. And for me this year, it's definitely this one because it's whenever a study is groundbreaking and it challenges long held beliefs, especially when it's done in humans like this one, we can really, I think, take so much from that and apply it into our lives. And this one sort of validates a lot of different aspects of an optimized protein intake. So I was very excited to see this. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more research like this because protein is becoming more and more, sort of the center of attention right now when it comes to the macros. So I'm excited to see more research like this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And that's one of the things I love about you is you're always going through the research and reporting on it. And that study that you talked about last year, that was an important study. Let's actually start with that because, we've been told, you and I both studied sports nutrition. For me, It was, over 15 years ago where I got my master's degree in sports nutrition. And I was always told, you're only going to absorb like 30 grams of protein in a meal. So if you go beyond that, it's not good for you. And of course, we're told all the myths, like it's going to damage your kidneys and all these different problems. And there was really no good research to make those claims. That was more a hypothesis that kind of just ran in the space. And then when they actually started really doing real research on this, we found otherwise. Can you talk a little bit about that study as we get started?
I would love to. I, really broke this study down in detail on the Optimal Protein podcast, and I, referred to it many, many times. It's a very controversial study. Let's start out by saying it's done by one of the most reputable, well-established research groups in the world. They're a university in Europe, and they are just very well recognized and admired worldwide for their work because they do a lot of isotopically labeled protein studies, which are very expensive, very demanding studies, and they put these tiny little sort of like, you could think of them as like neon tags on the amino acids. And then they have study participants ingest the protein, and then they do biopsies, and they're able to trace what happened to that one amino acid that was ingested. Where did it end up on the body? Did it actually end up in contractile muscle tissue, which is what we want generally when we're focusing on building muscle? And so it's an incredible group. It's led by Dr. Luc Van Loon and Dr. Jan Tremelin. It was sort of his idea to do this study. And so what they wanted to do is test if you consumed 100 grams of protein in one meal, what would happen to the amino acids over time after consuming that protein. So there's a couple of caveats here. The first is that the study was done in young trained males. So they had just trained and then consumed the protein, which definitely has an effect on the muscle protein synthetic response and why it lasted for so long. But they consumed the 100 grams of protein, and then they did muscle biopsy. So they took tiny pieces of the participants' muscle. I'm so thankful for these study participants because it's not something I would volunteer to do, but I'm so grateful that people do it.
They're they took these into their muscle, so it's not.
Can't imagine. It's not for me. It's such a valuable contribution to science, though. And so they took muscle biopsies from them for the next 12 hours. And in the past, before this study came out, the most you had ever seen this kind of muscle biopsy study done was about 4 hours. So they would see what happens for 4 hours. And then after that, it wasn't really, they didn't continue to do the muscle biopsies. Like I said, it's very costly. It's very invasive. So these are very expensive studies that you have to have, willing participants to do this. So they did it for 12 hours. And what they found is after 12 hours, the amino acids were still circulating in the bloodstream, and they were able to trace how many of the amino acids actually made it into the muscle tissue and how many actually made it into the contractile muscle tissue, which is what you want if you're building muscle. So it was pretty amazing. A pretty large degree of the amino acids made it into the contractile muscle tissue, but the reason this was so groundbreaking is that it showed that the amino acids are still circulating 12 hours later. And this is what went against everything that we've been told that you mentioned, that if you eat more than 30 grams of protein in one meal, the rest of that protein, like say you had 100 grams of protein, 70 grams of it would be quote unquote wasted. It would be oxidized. It would be excreted. Now, I've asked a lot of other scientists their opinion of this study. Some of them believe that, the title of it was very hyperbolic. Like, of course, there's an upper limit on muscle protein synthesis. The title implied there was none. And also the fact that it was done in trained males, probably accentuated how much or enhanced the period of time that, this occurred. But I also, heard from some scientists that they believe some of that protein was oxidized. And so it's been challenged quite a bit. But the main thing that it sort of overturned was our thinking about protein distribution, because so many people, I think, in the health space, they don't necessarily eat 3 to 6 protein meals a day. And so what it really showed is that the number one thing is not when you eat your protein or how often, it's do you get the protein you need in the day? And that's in a 24-hour period. And it also shows that you don't have to eat it within 45 minutes of a workout, which some people, like to say. You don't have to eat it. You don't have to be walking out of the gym and, slamming a protein shake. All that matters is you have it at some point 24 hours after you do your exercise. And all that matters really is that you hit that target of protein. Now, if you're an athlete looking for an edge, if you're in different special scenarios, maybe you're wanting to do 6 protein meals a day and you're wanting to space them out evenly and everything to optimize opportunities for muscle protein synthesis. But for the average person, who's just trying to optimize their health and wellness, we're all busy, some of us are parents, we're all busy working professionals. You don't have to stress so much about how much protein you're getting and making sure it's within an anabolic window that it turns out doesn't really exist.
Yeah, that's so good. Such a great breakdown and explanation. And I personally experienced this myself. So while I was going through school, studying exercise physiology and sports nutrition, I dealt with irritable bowel syndrome. And so I went from eating, the bodybuilder diet, 6-7 meals a day. I was eating 300 grams of protein, spread out throughout all of that. Big protein shake before I went to bed, wake up in the morning, big amount of protein in the morning. And that overwhelmed my gut and I developed irritable bowel. And then I lost 30 pounds, which for me, I've never tried to lose weight in my life because I'm very lean as it is.
Yeah.
So I lost a lot of muscle because I wasn't able to digest and absorb food effectively as I was dealing with the irritable bowel. Part of my process in getting better, obviously I made really good nutrition choices, went with real foods, a lot of the things I've talked about in my podcast, but I also started doing intermittent fasting. And back then nobody was talking about it. I mean, it's just 2005. Nobody was talking about it. I just intuitively did it because I felt better. And I started gaining my weight back, right? And I got to the point where I was the same weight that I was kind of at my peak as a personal trainer. And this is now I was in graduate school. And I felt actually stronger, healthier, and better. Yet I was taking courses where they were saying that, and I was intermittent fast. What I would do is I would actually drink a gallon of water before I ate food. So I would drink water throughout the day in the morning. And then by the time I got hungry, it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I would eat a ton of calories, lots of protein in about 4 to 5 hour eating window, right? And I don't recommend this for everybody, but for me, at that period of time, I'm 23 years old. It worked great. Like I just felt amazing all day long. I was able to perform at my best. I was top, I was a straight A student, top of my class. And this is somebody that I was really struggling in all those areas with brain fog when I had irritable bowel, got my gut healthier, all of that. And yet my teachers were saying things like, well, you can only absorb 30 grams of protein, right? And I'm like, well, how am I doing this? Because I would work out in the morning, right? So my workout would be at like 7 a.m. And then I go to my classes, all kinds of stuff like that. And then by the time I wait till I got hungry, and it was usually around 2 or 3 o'clock, and then I would eat, and then I would eat again probably around, 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. And then, top it off around 7 o'clock or so. And I would eat a ton of calories in that period of time. And I was gaining muscle and feeling amazing in the gym. And so I'm like, whatever science I'm learning here, it's incomplete, right? Like it's not really giving me the full answer, because I'm living proof that this isn't actually, it's actually, based on that science, I would have withered away, right? I wouldn't have gotten results.
Right.
And so, you know what I mean? So I'm glad to see that science is coming out.
Yeah, it's so exciting when you see studies that, validate things that you've experienced in your personal life, sort of by challenging some of the perceived notions or accepted notions out there. Now, the thing I love the most about this study is it just means that everyone can just take a deep breath and stop worrying so much about, scheduling their protein. Not everyone has to do the bodybuilder thing where, you've got all the meal prep and, you're eating chicken breast every 2 hours. There are athletes who need to do that to get a competitive edge, but most of us don't need to do that. And we don't need to, like I said, slam the protein drink, walking out of the gym. We don't have to have all that stress. I think there's a lot of stress out there about protein timing and distribution. And they had these really strict rules, for years. And now we're seeing that, a lot of that being challenged and questioned, due to really cutting edge research. And I think it's very exciting. People don't have to stress. Just figure out what your protein target is for the day, get your resistance training in, 3 to 5 times a week, and you're going to do great in terms of your body composition.
Yeah, 100%. I think we agree, primarily with the main nutrition principles, which are, reduce the amount of processed foods, just basically processed carbs, grains, things like that. Really prioritize protein. Make sure you're getting a minimum 30 grams each time that you eat in each meal. But you can do upwards of that. For some people are going to do great on 50, 60. I mean, I can easily do 100 grams, in a meal. And that actually makes me feel better than when I do 50, right? So find a really good protein target that makes you feel satiated, stabilizes your blood sugar, makes you feel really good. Add in healthy fats, right? Of course, we're going to talk about the protein sparing modified fats, where that may be a time where you don't, but in general, you add in healthy fats, right? Not the seed oils, but instead, your avocados, your extra virgin olive oil, grass-fed butter, right? Things like that. Find fats that you seem to respond best to, MCT oil, coconut oil, things like that. Of course, you're going to get a lot in your protein sources as well, right? So sometimes you don't even need to add in more because you've got fatty sources of protein. So you get those and then add in colorful fruits and vegetables up to your tolerance point. Some people do great with a lot of plant-based fibers. Some people don't do as well, right? So you do, up to your tolerance point with your, colorful fruits and vegetables and, a real food prioritized diet. And I think you're going to do really well in general. But like you said, that one principle of optimizing your protein, that's a mistake. A lot of people that are trying to follow a real food diet, they forget. And it ends up leading to overeating, cravings, all kinds of problems like that. You see that all the time, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's been the most transformative thing that I learned in my life was to think of protein first, to prioritize protein. And when I learned, the concept of protein leverage, and this is something, we were just talking about on my podcast, but I had no idea what it felt like to be full at a meal. Like I just didn't understand how other people would put their fork down at the end of the meal and leave food on their plate. Like I was usually finishing, my husband's potatoes or like eyeballing his plate to see if he was going to leave anything. He's someone who just eats to live. So I didn't understand. It was foreign to me. And I didn't know I could become that person once I started prioritizing protein and I understood the concept of protein leverage, which is that we will continue to seek food until we hit the amount of protein that our bodies need to provide all the essential amino acids. And so if you're under eating protein, if you're not prioritizing it, like you said, which is very common and very easy to do, then, like when I was plant-based, I was mostly eating fats and carbs, and I just didn't understand why I was never full. And when you flip sort of the script a little bit and prioritize protein, you realize that's where the satiety really is. And then if you start going low carb and, embracing those whole food principles, like you were talking about, and you lower the amount of processed carbohydrate you're getting, you may even borderline have some ketones on board. And ketones are incredibly powerful in terms of satiety. So that combination is, to me, I don't even know. Maybe there are drugs now that can replicate it, but if in terms of all natural ways of feeling satisfied after a meal, I don't know of anything more powerful in nature than ketones and protein together. So it makes a huge difference when you just start front loading the protein, prioritizing it, and everything else starts to fall in place. You naturally displace excess carbs and fats, because you have that protein, taking up that prime position on your plate, and it just makes everything kind of effortless. Like I say, you can become effortlessly lean once you sort of learn and apply some of these principles we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned the ketones. Obviously, they're going to create satiety. They also downregulate inflammation in your brain, which helps you think sharper and clearer, so you're more creative, better mood, less anxiety, just more calm brain. They help balance the glutamate to GABA ratio in your brain, so the gas and the brakes, so your brain functions sharply and better. They're reducing your risk of all-cause morbidity, right? Particularly neurodegenerative conditions, things like cancer. You're reducing your risk when you're getting ketones elevated in your bloodstream on a regular basis. Now, you and I, when we first learned about the ketogenic diet, we learned it was like a lower or moderate protein diet. And you had to be careful, because if you took too much protein, what we were taught was, and I taught this for years too, and I regret it, because I used to say, well, if you eat too much protein, it was interesting because I actually felt better eating a lot of protein, yet I would still teach it because that was what, I had learned was too much protein turns into sugar, gluconeogenesis in your bloodstream, and it will pull you out of ketosis. So don't do too much protein. And what do we know about that now?
Yeah, actually, gluconeogenesis is one of the reasons I went back to school to study biochem, because I was so frustrated by hearing completely different opinions on this process and people arguing whether or not it occurred, whether it was supply driven or demand driven. And I was like, I need to just understand biochemistry so I can figure these things out for myself. And I don't have to just, go back and forth. Like sometimes it feels like ping pong, when you're listening and getting your health advice from different, professionals or even influencers that, have a lot of credibility. It's really frustrating when, you hear these terms and concepts. And I just really wanted to understand it for myself. So I, like you, I thought, when I first did keto, I did the traditional approach where you suppress your protein intake, and that upregulates ketone production. And actually, interestingly, because we're going to, I think, probably lead into talking about that autophagy study, the low protein group still had more ketones. Like it is physiologically more ketogenic and anti-ketogenic to have higher protein, but that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. That's really what, I've come to learn over time. And actually, it can be an even better thing for things like fat loss, which this study that we're going to talk about actually documented really nicely. So it depends on what you're optimizing for. If you are optimizing for the highest number of ketones, then you might want to suppress your protein. But if you're optimizing for the best, fittest body composition and therefore metabolic health, you probably want to have higher protein, and you don't need to have the highest ketones possible. So, I learned that myself when I started to understand, the power of protein. And I started to actually find a lot of research showing that protein itself didn't actually block a lot of the processes that we wanted, that the favorable processes like the cellular cleanup. It's actually more so, the carbs, they're the most anti-ketogenic. And I'm a big fan of healthy whole food carbs, but the processed carbs and sugar, these things are anti-ketogenic, and, you definitely want to reduce and suppress those, not the protein. And, I've been following a modified keto diet, which is a high protein keto diet for many, many years, but I don't really do high fat anymore. And so I don't really know what to call it anymore. It's kind of like a high protein Mediterranean, like slightly ketogenic diet. I'm still sort of working on the terminology of it. But I've kind of taken all the best things I found from different approaches and combined them into the approach that I follow now. But once I switched to that optimized protein, keto or low carb approach, that really made all the difference.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think that, because you're lean, you're doing a lot of resistance training like I do as well. I'm lifting weights 6 days a week. Typically I stay very active with my kids. I know you do as well. Yeah. So that gives you a little more carb tolerance. Like you are depleting glycogen. You need, to, in a sense, to replace that is going to help you when you're going really low carb for extended period of time, and you're also very active, you're going to release a lot more stress hormones. And part of what we're trying to accomplish here is releasing stress hormones itself is not bad. Like people will say cortisol, like that if you fast, you're going to release cortisol. Well, cortisol is not a bad thing as long as it's buffered with growth hormone, right? Yeah. As long as you have enough growth hormone preserves lean body mass, your muscle, your bone. Cortisol will break that down because cortisol is a glucocorticoid, meaning its job is to break down tissue to spill out glucose, right? And it will pull out your glycogen, but it'll also break down muscle tissue if it needs to, or bone tissue, in order to increase the blood glucose. But growth hormone helps counter that and keeps your preserves your lean body mass, right? And turns on more fat burning. So that's really the key. And this is the thing, is that fasting will boost growth hormone, but also high protein will boost growth hormone, right? And we want things that are going to help boost growth hormone. Also good sleep habits, right? That's probably the most important actually thing for optimizing growth hormone is, basically trying to mitigate or minimize blue light at night, optimize melatonin, right? Things like that, all the circadian rhythm things that we teach, super key. And also resistance training helps boost growth hormone, right? And so we want all of those things, right? Like things that are going to help boost that without overdoing stress hormones. I think that's, really going to be one of the keys. And, I think when we do more of the protein restricted ketogenic diet, I think you're going to have more of an increase in stress hormone than a higher protein ketogenic diet. And that is also going to affect your sex hormones. Like that's what I found was when I was on more of a protein restricted or like a moderate protein ketogenic diet, my testosterone was lower. I didn't feel as good, even though my ketones were good. Yeah, and when I was on a higher protein, my testosterone is more optimized. I feel better in general. My ketones are slightly lower, but I'm still on a regular basis, I'm in a state of physiological or nutritional ketosis. And so I'm still getting the great benefits there, but also keeping my sex hormone, my testosterone levels elevated.
Yeah. Yeah. Super important.
Yeah. So it's kind of this dance of, and really like I guess you could say a moderately elevated cortisol and elevated growth hormone. So growth hormone will go up and down based on insulin. When insulin's up, growth hormone goes down. When insulin's down, growth hormone will go up. So if we're on a blood sugar stabilizing diet, it's going to help optimize the growth hormone. And when growth hormone is elevated and your cortisol is elevated, I actually call it a high performance state because cortisol gives you great wakefulness, right? And then cortisol does. And then growth hormone helps counteract the negative effects of higher cortisol, which would be like the catabolism, right, of your muscle tissue, right? So it counteracts that, and you get the benefits of the wakefulness, the great mental clarity, things like that. So all that to lead into what we're talking about here, which is this study that we talked about in the introduction.
Yeah.
The effects of fasting mimicking diets with low and high protein content. Because we were told that if you eat a lot of protein, you're blocking autophagy. And of course, autophagy, most of my listeners are familiar with that, but that means breaking down old cellular organelles, old mitochondria, old proteins in the cell. And we need to refresh these proteins on a regular basis. And so it's kind of this cellular cleanup process that's so critical for healthy aging, so critical for optimal function. All of us, everybody undergoes it, but we need to undergo it at a pretty good degree, right? And especially as we're getting older, after we go through like the growth stages of youth, we need to undergo a good amount of autophagy. We stop growing, right? We're not growing, you know, at least we don't want to be growing at that point necessarily, unless we're really trying to put on muscle. And we're really doing more cellular cleanup and rejuvenation, cellular rejuvenation. That's what autophagy does. And so we are told if you protein, we're told basically two main things block autophagy: carbs and protein. And if you eat too much protein, even if you're calorie restricted, that you are going to block autophagy. You're not going to get the benefits of autophagy. Now, all that leading into this study, Vanessa, go ahead and tell us about what we found here with the study.
Yeah, so this is, like I was telling you, my favorite study to come out this year. Now, one thing I just wanted to mention is over the years, I've really shifted the way that I weight and assign value to different studies. And I've learned that a lot of extrapolations that we take from animal studies and rodent studies, it turns out that a lot of things that we have extrapolated to humans from animals, they just don't translate. So I have come to rely way more on human trials than on animal trials. And there are things like mitochondrial biogenesis being activated from fasted exercise. That was something that a lot of us believed. And it was actually from rodent studies. And it wasn't until, I believe it was Dr. Christy Strostruck more recently, did this study in humans. And it turns out it doesn't actually stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis, because rodents are so sensitive to fasting because they eat continuously around the clock. And humans, although some humans, I've definitely been there, you know, some humans eat continuously. Most of us have, you know, timed meals with snacks in between. So you can't equate what you see in rodent research with humans to the same degree. Like Dr. Stu Phillips recently on my podcast said 10 to 15% of rodent research at most, and I think he's being even generous with that, can be applied to humans. So the reason I wanted to preface this is a lot of the research out there on autophagy is not from human subjects. It's actually sometimes from amoebas and from like petri dishes. And so sometimes we see headlines in the news or media, and they can be sometimes, you know, like clickbaity or whatever. We actually click on it, or maybe we don't. But a lot of headlines, you know, are meant to like excite people or have like really strong conclusions. And when you actually look at the research behind it, it's something done in a cell culture sometimes. So it cannot be extrapolated to humans. So a lot of this research done on fasting mimicking diets has sort of dictated the way that a lot of the world believes, you know, that protein is anti-autophagy, right? It's maybe anti-autophagic, if you want to say it that way. And, you know, a lot of that research was done in preclinical animal studies and very limited human research. So that's why this study excited me so much, because it was done in humans and they wanted to test whether or not a higher protein fasting mimicking diet, because the fasting mimicking diet is traditionally plant-based and very low in protein. Like you can even, I think, buy it and subscribe to it. Like Dr. Walter Longo has, you know, a product specifically where you can buy it and you just eat it and you're supposed to, you know, ramp up autophagy from this. And I'm not doubting that people are getting autophagy from that, but to suppress your protein intake, day after day, whether it's in like water fasting or these kinds of, fasting mimicking diets, I think could lead to muscle loss, especially because if your body doesn't get the amino acids it needs every day from food sources, it will take the amino acids from your muscles and give them to your critical organs because it wants to keep you alive. So I think it's important to not overly suppress protein for too long a period of time. But I personally did a lot of fasting like you used to, because I wanted to reap the benefits of all this autophagy. So I used to do a lot of water fasting, like a 4 or 5 day fast every quarter, like seasonally. And then I started learning about protein. And as you get older, you really don't want to risk your muscle because it's so hard to put it on and it's so hard to keep it the older you get. So I was like, how do I balance, my protein and autophagy? Now, traditionally, we've believed that protein is anti-autophagic because it stimulates mTOR. And so the mTOR and the AMPK pathways, being, what's the word? The
antagonists.
Yeah, antagonists. Thank you. Yeah. Being antagonist pathways, usually we believe mTOR has to be suppressed for AMPK to be elevated, and that's when you get autophagy. Now, it turns out in this study they had 46 healthy adult men and women, as well as a control group, and so they had one arm doing the low protein fasting mimicking plant-based diet, about 850 calories per day, and only 10% of calories were coming from protein, 45% from fat. And then the second arm was a high protein fasting mimicking group. So they had the same overall calories, 850, but 30% of calories from protein and 25% from fat. And this was a 7-day intervention. And then they had the control group as well. And both of the groups were doing a plant-based fasting mimicking diet because they wanted to, compare it with the traditional fasting mimicking diet. So they did a lot of measurements like body composition, heart rate variability, fasting glucose, and of note, they measured the autophagy-related gene expression in circulating blood cells. So this was really what they wanted, what they were seeking to evaluate is whether or not you would still get autophagy upregulated. So turns out the results, both groups had reduced body weight compared to the control, considerable amount of reduced body weight and fat mass, and their fasting glucose dropped in both groups, and IGF-1 decreased by about 35% in both groups. Now, when it came to autophagy gene expression was upregulated in both groups, in both the low protein and the high protein groups. And I think this was, pretty shocking. So they measured like ATG2A and GABA APL1 and a bunch of other autophagy genes. And they saw that autophagy was happening even in the high protein group. Now it seems that having this low caloric intake does not interfere with autophagy. And this is something that when people talk about mTOR being bad for you, in the context of longevity, I've always believed it's bad for you in the context of an oversupply of calories. But if you, are under eating on your calories, if you're doing, considerable caloric restriction, like when you do a protein sparing modified fast, which is something that we were both just discussing, that's very similar profile to this high protein fasting mimicking group. And, you're going to not only lose a ton of fat mass, you're also going to be able to protect your muscle. But what's most exciting from it is you will get upregulation in autophagy. And there were a few things that the high protein group got that the low protein group did not. So I think this is also like a really big takeaway, because I think like just looking at the results, you think they look pretty comparable. But in the high protein group, they actually had visceral fat reduction. So they significantly reduced their visceral fat in the high protein group, whereas the low protein group had no significant change in visceral fat.
That was surprising to me.
Yeah. And I mean, you would think that both groups would have, reduced it. So this was pretty huge because we were talking before about ketones versus fat loss. So the ketones were higher in the low protein group, but what are you optimizing for? If you're optimizing for the highest amount of ketones, then you might want to suppress a protein closer to 10%. But if you're optimizing for reducing your fat mass and your visceral fat, then definitely the high protein is the way to go. And there were also stronger metabolic benefits in the high protein group. So they had more decreased triglycerides, better HRV improvement, better gut microbiome diversity, which is really cool because this could all be sort of connected, with the autophagy and then upregulation of ULK1, which did not happen in the low protein group. And that's an autophagy initiation gene. The low protein group, like I said, had higher ketones and then had more FOXO1 and SIRT1 signaling, which are sort of classic fasting signatures. But in terms of results, they had a lot of shared benefits, but the high protein group edged out the low protein group. And, this is a massive, groundbreaking study for people who are interested in longevity, interested in autophagy, and, knowing you don't have to suppress your protein. You just want to suppress your calories temporarily to reap these benefits. And when you and I were talking recently, it made me realize that although I did successfully just do some protein sparing modified fasting, I actually now in maintenance want to do 1 day a week because I know that I can get all of this upregulation of autophagy from that 1 day a week. And, it's, I think, a really valuable approach. I think that a lot of people could apply.
Yeah, for sure. So you did a protein sparing modified fast and you lost 14 pounds. Is that correct?
Yeah. And it was all fat. So I kept all my hard earned muscle. And it was really interesting because I have been doing intermittent fasting for so many years. And with this, I was doing like 3 to 4 meals a day and I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoy this sort of lifestyle. And, I'm eating back at maintenance. I think it's really important to eat at maintenance. But I want to continue to do 1 day a week like that because I think in terms of longevity, it could have so many protective effects. So you were talking about the anti-inflammatory effects, but it could have so many beneficial effects. I think as, we get older to protect, protective effects against disease, chronic illness, and, you could just do it 1 day a week. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is, the alternate day fasting is something that became really popular and sort of first set off this like fire that wildfire around the world about intermittent fasting. And, when they were doing these down days and up days, and the down days, you would have 500 calories. And I was comparing that with protein sparing modified fasting, last week. And I was like, based on your numbers, which were 600 calories from protein, like you couldn't even get enough protein, even if all of your calories, the 500, were protein. So when you think of like sort of that ADF approach, it's probably very low in protein, very similar to, this like fasting mimicking approach. And I think that could be like, I don't want to say dangerous, but it could lead to some unfavorable, body composition changes over time, just like any other sort of like crash diet where protein isn't prioritized.
Sure. And I want to come back to the idea of doing it as like a wellness 1 day a week. But first off, let's go into a little more detail on yours. So when you were doing this, how long did you do it to lose those 14 pounds? And what was, in a sense, what were your meals? What did they look like?
Yeah, so I started August 1st and it was pretty quick. Like I was able to lose the fat pretty quick because I had been eating slightly over maintenance for a few months. And that's what sort of initiated, wanting to do a little mini cut. I didn't realize it. Like I had just stopped weighing myself. Like, I don't know, I was busy like in the summer with other things, but I did sort of start to notice. It's really hard to notice when you've gained weight because like people don't usually directly point it out to you like, hey, you look like you've gained weight, unless and certain cultures do because it's a compliment, but most people don't really point it out to you. So sometimes it it takes something like your clothes are getting tight or whatever. You finally like figure out that you've gained weight. So I was eating slightly above my maintenance by 200 or 300 calories. So by doing, this cut to protein sparing modified fasting, I was doing higher, like around 1,000 calories a day, which is what we were talking about. You can kind of get away with that if you are doing a lot of resistance training, because you are replenishing glycogen a little bit, and your metabolic rate is going to be a little higher from all that activity. And I also do a lot of steps every day. So I felt pretty good with 1,000 calories. And, based on the latest research, so if you look at a lot of the clinical research on protein sparing modified fasting, they usually recommend like around 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. I think that's around 0.7 grams of protein per pound. And very recent research came out. It was actually old research that got revised and republished by Dr. Eric Helms and Dr. Martin Ruffalo. They are bodybuilders, so they do protein sparing modified fast, right? Like most bodybuilders are doing protein sparing modified fast in the last week or two before they step on stage. And
they get the quick cut down.
Yes.
That is
yes.
how they do it.
Yes. And then they like carb up right before they step on stage. And so they published that your protein intake should be closer to 2 to 2.4 grams. That's closer to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and a little bit higher if you're in caloric restriction, especially this kind of caloric restriction. So I made sure to get at least that much protein every day. And then, around 30 grams of fat, because the literature shows, that's, you don't really want to go below that for too long for, hormone health. And, my carbs, just only whole food carbs. And they were, in similar ranges of what we were talking about, or what you were talking about. But I did actually have a lot of fun with the refeeds. And, being keto for so long, I hadn't had like more than like maybe 50 or 60 grams of carb a day for many, many years. And so I was doing regular fat refeeds for hormones, and to balance things out from doing the protein sparing modified fasting. So I do these protein sparing modified fasting blocks. And then I would do 1 or 2 days, usually 2 days of fat refeeds. But a couple times I tried carb refeeds. And that was really interesting. So I would do low fat on those days, high protein, very high protein. And then my carbs would be around 100 to 150 grams. And it was mostly from things like white rice and like bananas and oatmeal. And it's a really small amount of food and not as, really interestingly, not as satiating as the protein sparing modified fasting days. It actually makes you hungrier, because if you're sensitive to things like ketones, like I am, it's so anti-ketogenic that you have no ketones. And so like someone like me felt very hungry. But it was interesting for performance, because my glycogen would get so full that it hasn't been in so many years, that I would have these like really powerful strength training sessions. But I only did it a couple times because I didn't like the way it made me feel hungry. And so like I've been living with ketones for so long, I forgot what it feels like to not have them. And I'm like eating my meal and thinking about when I'm going to eat again. Like it's not fun, So I really feel for people who don't know about the power of ketones when dieting, because it's like white knuckling it, you're like looking at the clock, crossing the days on the calendar. Like that does not sound sustainable or fun to me.
Yeah. And that's why most diet plans don't really work. Most of the ones that are out there, particularly ones that are calorie counting, they don't work. They're not sustainable long-term, because you are kind of white knuckling it, and then, pharma came out with Ozempic and semaglutide to shut down the cravings. Right. But of course we know there's tremendous amount of side effects. There's $1 billion lawsuit on all these different side effects, things like that. And you can get these benefits from just optimizing your protein, right? It acts to acts, just as well, if not better, than taking a semaglutide medication, right, without those side effects and a fraction of the cost, right? So it's really a much better approach to doing this is just making sure you're getting enough protein on board. And you can go through those periods where you're doing a protein sparing modified fast. Like if you're out there and you want to drop 10 pounds, you've got some extra visceral fat. That's really the fat you want to lose. That dangerous fat that's around your organs, we call that visceral fat. All of us have some degree of it. You're not going to get rid of it completely, but you want to be in a healthy range with your visceral fat. And if you're ready to burn some of that, you can do this protein sparing modified fast for a period of time. Like how many days were you doing it before you did a refeed?
So I actually, I actually did the approach that Maria Emmerich does, which is I would do 3 days a week of protein sparing modified fasting. So it's kind of like the alternate day fasting approach. And then I would do refeed Saturday and Sunday, which is really nicely aligned with going out for brunch. And, I had the other day I had a refeed day, and I one of my last ones was like eggs Benedict, with like tons of bacon and hollandaise sauce. And then we went out for duck for dinner. So it was just getting so much protein and fat. But you can also align it nicely with like being out and socializing. And that worked really well for me. So in between the days that I wasn't doing the protein sparing modified fasting, I was eating at maintenance, like keto style, and the refeeds I was also eating at maintenance. So I never really went over maintenance. I know some people will do that, but I didn't want to counteract all the progress that I was making from the protein sparing modified fasting days. And the other thing I want to say, which was really interesting, is I, noticed a lot of like weight fluctuations throughout the week. But every time I would do the refeed day, I would usually have this like whoosh, like 1 or 2 days after. So you can actually see the effect that it has on your hormones. It has on your metabolic rate, and your body kind of like lets go. It feels like safe and provided for and all those things, so it can comfortably continue. But for me, like you pointed out, being on the leaner side where I started out, I really didn't want to do it for that long, because I don't want to have any negative effects on the hormones. If I was just doing if I wanted to do a longer, more protracted approach, I wouldn't do more than a 25% caloric deficit, and that's typically what I recommended to people. But this was just very effective and very fast. So, that's kind of how you feel when you realize you have put on some extra fat. You just want it off tomorrow or, yesterday, not in like 6 months, but.
Yeah, for sure. So typically, like if somebody wants to lose 10 pounds, you can do a protein sparing modified fast. Typically you're doing 800 to 1,000 calories, high protein. I have a detailed blog article on it that goes into detail, and also a podcast. Maria Emmerich has a great book that I resource in there with recipes, things like that. You do have to be intentional, because it's not necessarily easy to get protein without fat, because you're basically consuming it's a low fat diet. So you do have some fat, but it's very low fat in general, high protein. So you have to be intentional about consuming that, and especially making the food taste good when you don't have the fat with it. Oh, I think you're muted, Vanessa. Did you mute?
I wanted to say, you asked me what my meals look like on a typical day, and I'm sorry I didn't answer that earlier. I found it fascinating to learn about the different proteins, as you were saying, and how much fat is in all these different proteins, because I knew in general, I had a picture like tenderloin has way less fat than ribeye, for example, but I didn't know there was this whole world like seafood, and like shrimp, scallops, and a lot of white fish have no fat, like virtually none, just like trace fat. So that makes it very easy, especially if you like things like shrimp. Like I would make for dinner a lot of like shrimp taco bowls with like lettuce, and I would have cauli rice. I was never a big cauliflower person, but cauli rice on a protein sparing modified fasting day is amazing. with like fresh lettuce and cut up, tomatoes and cilantro. Is like a taco bowl with hot sauce was one of my go-tos. I did a lot of like shrimp fried rice with the cauliflower rice. You can be really creative. And in the morning, I would have a lot of like my high protein crepes. I have like these high protein crepes that have not a lot of fat in them at all, just enough, like 5 grams of fat from one egg yolk. So you get tons of choline and B12 and lots of micronutrients. And also like high protein French toast. I love Maria Emmerich's protein bread, and I use that for sandwiches and, all kinds of things. It makes it really easy, just with some cold cuts, low fat cheese. I used a lot. I found this, I guess like Philadelphia has this new cream cheese that's high protein. I don't know if it's everywhere, but they have it in Europe and it's only 2% fat. So it's super low, but it still gives you like this cream cheese effect. So, really high protein meals, lots of seafood. I still did meals with like chicken and tenderloin on occasion. Ground beef, really interestingly, you can get like 90-10 ground beef. And if you like cook it up and brown it, and then I read about people doing this years ago in sort of the low fat craze, but you can rinse it in a colander and you can get it down to like 5% fat. So I had a couple days where I was like, I really need to have ground beef, and sometimes you just crave, I don't know, the iron or like the other nutrients. Yeah. And usually you think I can't have ground beef on a, super low low fat day, but there's definitely things you can do like that. And just with the seafood, not all seafood is low fat, which is really interesting. So like salmon, even tuna, I thought tuna had like no fat in it, but when you're counting the grams, like you're saying, suddenly it's like, maybe I'll have the salmon and the tuna on my refeed days or my maintenance days, not on, the protein sparing modified fasting days. I just did a couple episodes of Q&A, and one question came up was like, can I have my fatty coffees on the protein sparing modified fasting days? And I was like, you definitely don't want to do that on a protein sparing modified fasting day, but you could have it on your maintenance days for sure, or on your, on your refeed days. But on the PSMF days, you want the lowest fat you can get. And there's fat, like you said, in all the protein. I did a lot of egg whites, a lot of like turkey, and then even like cooking it in different ways to like render out the fat and stuff. Like it sounds like a lot of effort, but once you start sort of figuring it out, there's a lot of options out there. And I really enjoyed like having all this seafood, because like I have salmon a lot, but other than that, like I don't have a ton of seafood. So it's, there's a lot that you can sort of like discover and have fun with.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, you do need to be strategic as you go about doing it. And now you do it one day a week, and that's something that you're recommending. So I know throughout my career, I've recommended people do like a 1 day a week, 20 to 24 hour fast to get autophagy on a regular basis. But with this new research, what you're seeing is, hey, we can still eat. You don't have to do it like a pure water fast or like a no calorie fast, but instead you just do a calorie restricted high protein, the protein sparing modified fast, where you're getting 800 to 1,000 calories. But, normally most people need 2,000, just for reference. And if you're very active, you might even your baseline might even be more. So it is calorie restricted, but you're still consuming food. You're consuming the high protein levels to give the satiety, but you're also getting the ketones and the autophagy.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm doing my protein sparing modified fasting day today, and I'm having roasted turkey, roasted butternut squash, and cauliflower rice. And it's so good together. It almost tastes like, Thanksgiving meal. Or I'll do like tenderloin steak with broccolini and lots of veg, like roasted zucchini. And so you can still have a ton of vegetables. You want to get as many micronutrients in as possible. It kind of becomes a little bit of a game that you can try to get as many micronutrients as possible without, overdoing it on the fats or the carbs. And to me, I could never go back to water fasting. Like now that I know this, and this is something that I do regularly. It's so much easier to do a protein sparing modified fasting day than to just drink water all day, especially if like, you have kids and your family or like work, like routines and stuff. Like, I got in the habit of doing it, but it was always very challenging. I almost like took it on as a challenge, as a way to like test myself and everything. And I was glad that I was able to do it, but talk about white knuckling. I mean, that's like, it's a long day to just only drink water and maybe like tea or coffee. If you can have 3 delicious meals or 2 meals and a protein shake, and because you're going to have ketogenesis upregulated and you're going to have all the protein that your body needs, you're going to preserve all your muscle, and you will most likely not experience much hunger at all. This is really like the natural GLP-1. I mean, protein does stimulate GLP-1, but it really has so many benefits, and you don't have to only drink water for 1 day a week for the rest of your life. I mean, people can still do that if they like to do that. I'm not like bashing anyone who likes water fasting. I did it myself many, many years. But I way prefer this.
Yeah, if you're out there, try both approaches, right? Give it a few months and kind of alternate. 1 week do the protein sparing modified fast, one week do the water fast, and then just see how you feel, on each day, and kind of
totally
check it out. See how you respond the next day, how you feel the next day, and test it out for yourself. Thanks so much, Vanessa, for coming on and sharing this. This is a really important study, so it's really good. I'll have the link in the show notes, and you've done a bunch of podcasts on this on the Optimal Protein podcast.
Yes.
You can also find her at ketogenicgirl.com, and you've got your tone device, ketone breath analyzer, right, that people can check out as well, which actually you just breathe into, so you don't have to do blood
Thanks for mentioning that. I love just being able to breathe into it. And it's, a great proxy for fat burning and for autophagy, and you don't have to painfully prick your finger, deal with those test strips. You just breathe into it and you can see your ketones going up when you're doing a protein sparing modified fasting day or a water fasting day.
Yep. Awesome. Well, really good stuff. Again, you can check her out, Optimal Protein Podcast and ketogenicgirl.com. Thanks again, Vanessa. Always enjoy our conversations, and be blessed.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on your wonderful podcast.
Thank you. All right.